Good evening. You're watching Bharat Voice. We are live from Bangalore. I am Ritika Acharya, and today we have for you yet another episode on India's growing soft power across the world. Now, US elections is something that everyone is waiting for. The upcoming US election is something, the result is something that's the talk of the town. Everyone wants to know what the result is going to be, who's going to win, and what the impact of the US election is going to be on India. Of course, we want to know about the India-US ties as well, the India-US trade relations as well. Today, we have with us to talk to us about all this and also much more about India's foreign affairs, about India-China relations as well. We have with us Dhruva Jaishankar. Dhruva, welcome to Bharat Voice.
Thank you for having me.
So Dhruva is the director of the US initiative at the ORF, which is the Observer Research Foundation. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute of Australia. He also writes for publications like the Washington Post and the New York Times, and also writes and talks on the effects of global development on India's politics, economics, and society, as well as the foreign affairs. Dhruva, let's start with the foreign affairs of India. So now many people believe that, we still live in a bipolar world. There are two important nations across the world, two growing important nations. Earlier it used to be USA and Russia. Now it's considered to be USA and China. Mm-hmm. But if I have to put it in the words of our external affairs minister, he says that we actually live in a multipolar, interconnected world. Mm-hmm. I want to know your thoughts on that. Because, of course, we cannot ignore that India has now established good relations with not just two nations, mm-hmm. with almost every nation across the world. Mm-hmm. So can we ignore that India is coming up as a leading power in the world?
So that's something that's a subject of a lot of debate, both amongst academics, and there's a lot of academic literature on this subject. There's also a lot of political commentary on the subject that we read about. I think it's clear, the Cold War period from 1945, the end of World War II, to 1991 was characterized as a largely bipolar world. And I mean, that's a slight oversimplification, but there were predominantly two powers, the US and Soviet Union. Both had an alliance network, both had a vision for the kind of world they wanted to see and tried to pursue policies to advance those missions. But, again, it was slightly more complicated than that because you had other powers, including sometimes a very autonomous France, China, Germany and Japan that in the 70s and 80s particularly grew much faster and often had very autonomous policies from the US and Soviet Union. But by and large, I think the bipolar framework was a useful way of thinking about the Cold War period. The post-Cold War period, we saw what many characterize as a unipolar world, which is one where the US was predominant following the collapse of the Soviet Union. A country like China didn't have nearly the same resources or wealth. And so the US was able, for a long time in the 90s and early 2000s to in some ways have its way, in terms of determining norms, in terms of, whether it was interventions in places like the Balkans or in Afghanistan and so forth after 9/11. But increasingly after 2008, we see, the rise of several powers, but most notably China. And China's, rise has been on a scale and speed that has really been historically unprecedented. It's a billion plus population and so forth. So that, I think, is leading to this realization that we're increasingly in a more bipolar world. Although the gap between the US and China still remains quite large. But again, perhaps more so than during the Cold War period, we're also seeing many aspects of multipolarity. That it's not just the US and China that can determine everything between them. You have India's rise out of if it were not for China, India's rise would have been seen as much more significant. The fact is, it has been overshadowed by China's rise, which has been on a greater scale. But increasingly, again, you have a much more remilitarized Japan. You have which still plays a major role as an international lender. You have the European Union, again, which as a bloc is a very powerful trading bloc and setting a set of rules and norms. So again, I think we're entering a world which will exhibit characteristics of unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity at the same time, largely depending on what the issue is. I would say, just to add one last thing, is that the big difference, I think, between today's context and the Cold War, the one big difference is that we have seen a level of economic and social interdependence that was simply not there during the Cold War period. And that has complicated levels of analysis. So today, the US and China are each other's largest trade partners. Still have an exchange of people and in each other's academic systems, in each other's social systems. That was again simply not possible. And it's not just the US and China. I mean, the world is much more interconnected, and the coronavirus today now is a development that now in some ways may be a bit of an inflection point.
Okay, so you're saying we'll see a mix of everything, unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar as well. Okay, all right, fair enough. Dhruva, on a lighter note, I have to tell you that, I lived in London for a couple of years, traveled to many countries. There's something that I noticed that, you travel to even the remotest parts of Europe. You talk to people. Well, earlier they knew very little about India. They knew about food. They knew about, let's say, only Bollywood. But now you cannot ignore the Modi brand. Everyone knows a Modi. And whoever you talk to, people anywhere in Europe or across the world, everyone knows a Modi. Do you think that, all the overseas events that were organized where, Modi visited USA, Prime Minister Modi visited USA, the Howdy Modi, and UK welcomes Modi, these type of events have really directly or indirectly helped in building India's image and also helped in strengthening India's relations with, the respective countries as well?
I think narratives matter, leadership matters to a great degree, and leaders sort of being active and engaging and does certainly make a difference. However, I think the big difference has not actually been an individual leader in terms of India's, the perceptions of India. And I would agree. I've gone to parts of Central and Eastern Europe or North Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia, where 15, 20 years ago the awareness about India was significantly less. Today it is significantly more. But I would attribute the big change actually to the Indian diaspora, which is today, for many people, it's not that they have strong views based on what they read in the press or about India's political leadership or anything like that. It's often that they know somebody who is Indian. They have a neighbor or a friend or their doctor or their teacher. And that is what actually informs people's, I think, worldview. And that has been, I think, the big change of the last 15, 20 years. I lived in parts of Central Europe when I was growing up, and you would never see Indians. We were in a country where there were 100 Indians in the entire country. Today, that's not the case. Many more people there would have had exposure to Indian culture, Indian people. So I think that's the big difference. And I think arguably that is what actually Prime Minister Modi has been trying to tap in a way when he travels. It is actually events for the diaspora that he does, whether it's at Wembley Stadium or in Madison Square Garden or in Houston or Australia or wherever. These are ways of actually engaging with the Indian diaspora in those countries. So I think I would say that that's the big difference. It's not been political as much.
And we obviously cannot ignore the 13 million NRI population outside India and 18.7 million population, which are POIs. We cannot ignore them.
Yep. And they're an important link for India and the world in some ways. If you look at if you see in the Indian press, what are issues in countries that Indians follow, it is often very directly linked to the NRI community. It's places where the Indians go to study, places where Indians go to work, places where Indians live and have family and are successful. So in the middle, it's West Asia, the Gulf, it's places like Australia, Europe, North America that get the preponderance of attention.
Absolutely. Okay. Now let's talk about something that everyone wants to hear about, the US elections. We cannot ignore Trump. We cannot ignore Donald Trump. So what I want to understand from you is, there's a lot of, again, if I have to put it in the words of the External Affairs Minister, he says that let's not demonize Trump, let's analyze Trump. Do you think that there is because we see that there's a growing atmosphere of, talking about Trump as a leader who's proved to be inefficient, who's proved to be as a leader who is busy on Twitter, a lot of Twitter controversies, he's unpredictable, and how he has not really proved to be that great for USA. But I want to understand from you is he really that bad for USA? Because after all, you cannot ignore the fact that, he's he opened the dialogues with North Korea when other leaders were not ready to do it. He's also the recent the UAE-Israel peace deals and with Bahrain as well. And also the fact that US did not even go, let's say, to war with Iran when a lot of people were expecting it. So can you, is he really that bad?
No, so I think you have to look at things from two different perspectives. I mean, there is a U.S. debate on Trump. I mean, it's a very highly charged political debate, and in some ways, this November election that we're going to see in 2 months is going to be a referendum on Trump's performance over the last few years. I think from an Indian, if you take a step back and look at it from an Indian point of view, and this is very distinct from whatever is happening in the U.S. Domestically, and even in U.S. foreign policy. The fact is that the U.S. elected a leader who received 48% of the popular vote. 48% of adult Americans voted for him in November 2016. He won the Electoral College by effectively 3 states more than many had expected. And the fact is, he was going to be the president for the next 4 years, and perhaps the 4 following. So I think when you put yourself in the shoes of Indian policymakers in November of 2016, the question is what to do about it. And one of the things that I've written about this is that one is, I think, Indian officials actually hedged against the possibility of a Trump victory in November, which many people did not, including by engaging some of Trump's advisors early on. And then afterwards actually made a pitch for him. I mean, it took 6 months before the first summit between Trump and Modi in Washington in the summer of 2017. And what Trump indicated was actually it was not as acrimonious or antagonistic as Trump's meetings at the time with other leaders, including Xi Jinping, including with the Europeans and others. So, I think efforts were made to engage with the Trump administration to secure what India saw as its own interests at the time. And I think that was ultimately about, which is it's very easy to become emotional about Trump's victory. And many people continue to have, including in India, frankly, continue to have very strong emotional views, positive or negative, about Trump.
Whatever happens in the US has to come to India.
So I think the question was, do you get influenced by the internal debate in the US or not? And, I think if you contrast, for example, the approach that a lot of Europeans have taken, which has been frankly, a very emotional response to Trump and some of the things he has done and said. It has not necessarily been to the benefit of the overall relationship between the Europe and the United States. So I think that's a sort of cost-benefit calculation that every country had to make. I would say certain countries, India, Japan, Israel, to some degree Australia, a few others, have said, listen, whatever Trump's personal views, whatever, we are going to, the relationship with the United States is more important than any individual leader, and it will survive any individual leader. And so it's best to engage with the leadership that you have, even if you're not going to get whatever you want. Others have taken a very different approach.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's talk about Biden as well. So I was reading an article. You've written this that if Joe Biden wins, there is a possibility of us having stability in decision making. He's going to be obviously less unpredictable, and also there's going to be more focus on green power and climate change, something that Donald Trump has completely ignored. He denies that there's climate change, and of course we've also on one hand I say that's great, that's good. But I would take the liberty of saying here that there's a certain fear. Because in India, what happens is that people have noticed that whenever a president from the Democratic Party has come to power, it's seen that even in the time of Clinton, even in the time of Obama, there is a certain interference in the internal matters of India. They will not shy away to talk about Kashmir. They will not shy away to talk about religious freedom or the condition of Indian Muslims in India. Topics that would really upset us Indians. But on the other hand, when Donald Trump was in power, he did not really comment on the CAA or the abrogation of 370. What are your thoughts on that?
No, look, I think you have different constituencies in the United States. This is, just as you have in every democratic country, including in India, and which emphasize different things. And, for Trump, I think, issues like, the social policies of other countries simply just isn't an issue for him. In the US, I think you'll always have, and you have had for many years, I mean, going back to even before World War II, you've had a strong constituency that has believed in putting a vision of American, an American vision of human rights up front and center in American foreign policy. You have this on the right and the left. You have Republicans and a lot of Democrats, and you'll continue to have that. So I think that there will always be voices that believe, and they will criticize not just India, although every mention of India will receive a lot of attention in the Indian press. But these are the same people who will also criticize China and Russia and Pakistan and Iran and Saudi Arabia, and frankly also the United States as well. So I think that there will always be that constituency. I think that they're entitled to their views, and I think there's not always a need. I think every minor mention gets a lot of attention in India, sometimes disproportionate to the actual intent of what they're trying to say. I think there's a second issue at play as well, which is there is also a level of there's a level of constituency building in the United States as well. And sometimes a lot of the comments, particularly lately, have been in response to constituents' views in the US as well. So I think that we'll continue to have that dynamic, regardless of whether Trump or Biden wins, particularly amongst certain members of the US Congress. So that will continue. At the same time, I think there is an understanding about what developments are taking place in India. People in the Democratic Party have been briefed about this, as have many Republicans. Some have been persuaded, some have not. So I think there's a tendency to overread a little bit into all of that. The fact is that under both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, the U.S.-India relationship actually deepened. And so I don't see any reason to believe that the differences that may actually exist and may be real in terms of these views will actually derail the overall India-U.S. relationship, as some people in India have portrayed it. And frankly, some people in India would actually like to see it happen. They would like to see more of the India-U.S. relationship not move forward for various reasons. So I don't think it's going to be as big an issue. Although I do think some continued criticism, and again, not unique to India, will continue.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Just adding to that, if you could also emphasize a little bit on what else can India possibly look at if Joe Biden comes to power.
I think a lot of it is still uncertain, to be honest, and there are differences of views reflected by many of Biden's advisors. So they're not all on the same page. There's not a uniform platform. We'll see competing interests, and a lot of it will depend on who gets appointed to key positions in a Biden administration should he win it this November. But a few things I think are quite clear. I think you will see a less, in some ways, a more generous approach, I think would be a way of putting it, when it comes to trade with countries like India. Which is Donald Trump has been obsessed with narrowing trade deficits. This is like a single point issue for him. You won't see that same emphasis on trade. However, that was going to be sorry, that was going to be my next question. I'm going to we can come back to that in more detail. But I think trade, immigration. Trade and immigration, you'll see two issues where you won't see as much of an obsessive focus. Although, by the way, I think there will be problems that will continue. I think there's an emphasis on growth for the middle class in the U.S., which is part of the Democratic Party platform. So it won't be sort of that carte blanche. I think there will still be tough trade negotiations, but it won't be as focused on narrowing the trade deficit as Trump has made it out to be. Immigration, I think there will be some movement towards immigration reform. Biden has himself spoken about this and how that would benefit Indian Americans. But I think a lot will still hinge on what legislation Congress is able to pass. Environmental issues will be another one which will be back on the table. I think the uncertainty is a little bit on the overall strategic outlook, particularly what their approach to China would be and the consequent approach. There's definitely many Democrats who would essentially like to see a continuation of what Trump has been putting in place with the free and open Indo-Pacific, but there are others who have greater skepticism about that and believe that engagement, some form of engagement with China is on the cards. I think the other issue, there are other issues in the bilateral relationship, including defense sales and such, where there isn't a great deal of clarity, but I think in the absence of a great deal of clarity, we should expect a continuation of current policy.
Okay, all right. So what I was saying was, it's interesting that you mentioned the narrowing of the trade deficit, because I I want to understand from you as to why is it that you think that Joe Biden will not probably follow on the footsteps of Donald Trump, because seeing the current situation of seeing the economic situation of USA right now, the unemployment rate is the highest, is 13 million as of last week. The GDP numbers are very down. It's actually US is now going to push for India to buy more US goods. That's not going to happen.
Well, look, I think it depends on what the recovery looks like. Already, actually, both the employment figures and the GDP figures have bounced back a little stronger than many people had expected. And if you look at what the sources of the big decline in GDP over the last 2 quarters has been, it's largely been in the consumer side. It's been, healthcare, it's been retail, those areas of it. So those are likely to bounce back much more quickly. If it continues, I think the concern is that if the pandemic continues, that there would be longer term scarring effects. But as of now, the recovery looks like it may not be as bad, as some had feared earlier. So I think that's one thing to look for. Obviously, I think there will be an emphasis on jobs, and even if there is a bounce back in employment figures, and Biden himself has stressed that, which is he would like to engage in trade that benefits, in his words, the American middle class. So I do think there will be some tough trade negotiations with India and with other partners. There were hearings. People forget now that there were hearings on India during the Obama administration as well on its trade practices. Certain lobbies were very active, particularly the pharmaceutical, medical devices, and dairy and others. So again, it's not that everything will be okay. The one difference is Trump has made trade deficits a particular issue. And the fact is that India has trade deficits with almost every country except the United States, every major economy. So it's a sort of strange thing to single out India, particularly for this, given that overall it, like the United States, is a consumer-driven economy that is a net importer.
Okay. All right, Dhruv, there are a couple of questions coming in. So
Sure.
Somebody's asking a question. Does Trump stand any chance of winning?
Short answer is yes. So, I think, look, I'm not in the business of prediction, and I don't think prediction is a mug's game. Nobody, even on the day of the election in 2016, did not, only a small minority predicted Trump would actually win. But I think you can look at the election in the next 2 months in a few ways. One is traditionally incumbents have an edge, one. Two is that it's almost certain Biden will win the popular vote. Democrats have won the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections. So that, I think, actually privately, some of Trump's advisors have already accepted that. The question is whether he'll win the Electoral College. 2 months is still a long time. A lot could happen in the next 2 months. We'll still see the debates. For now, Biden seems to have a healthy lead in the polls, including in the key swing states. So it does give him a strong edge. But a big thing, I would say look out for 2 things. One is what happens in the debates, and does that affect the polls at all? In 2012, for example, Mitt Romney managed to narrow the polls significantly after his performance in the first debate against Obama, where he just came in better prepared. The second thing I would look for is voter turnout, because the big question will be, I think there's an expectation that Trump voters will come out in higher numbers.
Vote not, and how they're going to vote, and that's
exactly, yeah. So there are question marks about that. So I think the combination of voter turnout and the debates will really shape the outcome. But as of now, I think the polls give a healthy lead to Biden. The incumbency favors Trump. So I don't think it's just keeping that in mind. I don't think it's wise yet to make strong predictions one way or the other.
Okay. There's another question which says, a lot of young Indian Americans seem to favor the progressive left-leaning Democrats. Why is that?
So, Indian Americans have traditionally been voted Democrat. The majority of Indian American political donors are Democrat. They live, with the exception perhaps of Texas and Florida, which is a swing state. The large concentrations of Indian Americans are in blue states, are in California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, and places like that. So I think that there's obviously been a traditional tilt towards the Democrats. The progressives have, a progressive wing of the Democratic Party has generally appealed more to youth, and across, across ethnic and other divides. And it's driven by a few things. I think there's social consciousness, minority rights issues, skepticism of military force and external intervention. So all of these are messages that from the progressive Democrats that resonate very positively with younger voters. And so I think for a combination of these two reasons, the traditional democratic leanings of the Indian American community, coupled with the demographic trends of younger voters gravitating towards progressives, it's not unexpected or unusual that young Indian Americans would be voting for progressives.
Okay. Dhruva, I'm going to take last question here from the audience. There's another question, which is, how do you see India's position on Turkey as it takes hostile stand on Kashmir?
Right. So, the India-Turkey relationship has always been a rather difficult one. But although the reasons have changed over time, for a long time, Turkey had very close relations with Pakistan because, in fact, many in Pakistan looked at Turkey as a model for a secular Muslim majority country that had a strong military, and that was seen as the model that the Pakistan army in some ways used to justify its own position in Pakistan. And that coupled with Turkey's NATO status and such meant that relations were traditionally difficult. But now I think under Erdogan, the current president, and the sort of revolution he has ushered in, which has moved Turkey away from that old secularism towards a much more it's not just at home, it's in his foreign policy, whether it's in Libya, Syria, his stance on the Israel-Palestine issue, has taken a position that I think, from an Indian point of view, is quite disruptive. And so that really has gotten in the way of the relationship. It's even affected to some degree the economic and trade relationship, which is something I believe when Erdogan was last in India a few years ago, he was trying to emphasize, which is let's set aside our political differences, let's have some stronger business-to-business dealings. So I think that, and then I'd say the final factor is also the performance of the Turkish economy, which has some sort of severe structural factors, problems as well. I mean, India has its own problems, but Turkey has had a major currency depreciation, amongst other things. So a combination of these things means that, I think we are in for a period of a somewhat difficult India-Turkey relationship. The fault lines that are forming in West Asia, in what India calls West Asia and Middle East, arguably today India's two closest partners in the region are the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Israel. And Turkey finds itself on the other side of regional fault lines. So, I think that all explains what's happening. But at this point in time, it's not the warmest of relations.
Correct. All right. So I'm going to move back to the questions which I had for you. Let's now talk about, because we were talking about US elections, you talked about the popular vote. Let's talk about Kamala Harris, because again, that's something you don't know. So what happens is that, of course, everyone's talking about her Indian origin, her mother being India, her mother's from Tamil Nadu, her dad being from Jamaica. Although she being there cannot sweep away the the entire election process, because Indians it is 1.2, 1.3 million. And on the other hand, her African identity could be at play, because the diversity card is being played very well here, because there are I believe there are 14 to 15% of the African population in voter population in the USA. But my question to you is it the diversity card that's being played really well here, or is it the woman card? Because if she becomes, then she's going to be the first ever woman vice president of USA. Or is it a combination of both?
Look, I think there was a vetting process that Biden had for selecting a vice president. It was, these things from what we know from the recent past, these things tend to be quite intensive. They look into every element of your background. There's a lot of polling data that is used, saying how do what's the name recognition of these people, where are they likely to galvanize votes in how they play out in various swing states and so forth. So a lot of thought went into the selection of the vice president. Biden committed up front very early on that he would select a woman, and so that narrowed the field a little bit. But there was still 6-8 candidates that were being discussed, and 3 or 4, particularly the short list came down to 3 or 4 of them. In some ways, she checks a lot of boxes. So she's subsequent to her nomination, she has described herself as South Asian American, as Asian American, as Indian American. So that checks those boxes. And she would be a groundbreaking candidate for those reasons. The African American identity as well, a woman. She brings a sort of a legal background. She was Attorney General of California. So I think her profile checks the boxes of what one analysis put it quite nicely, which is she is not of the progressive wing of the party, but she has consistently voted with the progressive wing of the party as a senator. And again, so she's the paradox in some ways is she's both a conservative pick, but also because of her identity, also in some ways quite a revolutionary pick. So I think that all of those thoughts went into her selection. And she's been playing up all of those different aspects of her personality and background.
That's rightly put, because she checks a lot of boxes. So you're saying that she's going to appeal to not just, of course, African and the Indian, but if she's going to appeal to mass population, the whites as well, even the, let's say, Hispanics, Asians, South Asians, and everybody.
I think the idea is to appeal to as broad-based a constituency as possible. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course. Okay. I have one last question for you. Actually, the second last. So let's talk about India and China now. So India and China are, of course, the 2 oldest surviving civilizations of the world. The only 2 countries which have over 1 billion population. But, of course, we cannot ignore that now in today's times, sadly, because of the tension between India and China, everyone's now talking about war. Do you think that the relations between India and China are so spoiled, or let's say it's reached a point that there's now absolutely no room for discussion, no room for a diplomatic solution for this problem?
Well, no, I don't think you can rule out some somewhat peaceful solution. I mean, I would hesitate to call it a peaceful solution because we've already seen the loss of life on the boundary for the first time since 1975. So it won't be a peaceful resolution, even if there is a swift resolution to this. But I don't think that should be ruled out quite yet. But what we have seen, I think, is a bit of an inflection point in the India-China relationship. There have been suspicions about China in India going back to the 1950s, particularly after the 1962 war. And the gradual normalization only took place from the 1970s to the recent past. But in some ways, this was a long time coming. We've seen antecedents of this after 2008, but particularly with India in 2013, 14, 17, where we did see India-China standoffs that were in each case resolved diplomatically, fortunately without casualties. This year is significantly different. I mean, it's the largest mobilization that China has done since 1962 against India. There are multiple points of friction. It's not again, the recent episodes have mostly been focused on a single point. And the fact is, that there were casualties. This did result in the loss of 20 lives in the Galwan Valley, and then one subsequently in a recent operation on the Indian side. That I think that this will undoubtedly color India-China relations for the foreseeable future, even again if there is a resolution that is swift. And it is played in a few ways. One, I think there will obviously there already have been consequences to the economic relationship. Some of these are likely to remain, they're or unlikely to be reversed. The second thing is public opinion, which is, public opinion surveys showed that there was a relatively neutral, not necessarily warm, but relatively neutral Indian public when it came to China. That is, roughly, 1/3 had a negative view, 1/3 had a positive view, and 1/3 of Indians had no strong views about China. But I expect, I have not seen any polls from the last few months, but I expect that if similar surveys were conducted today, that the public views of China would be overwhelmingly negative. So I think these two factors, the longer term economic consequences, and the public, adverse public opinion will mean that this 2020 will be seen as an inflection point for India-China relations.
All right, so the longer term economic consequences, something we'll see. But for people who've tuned in right now who are asking questions about Biden's presidency be different, how will it be different from Trump? These are questions that we've already addressed. Please watch our interview. Dhruva, before we let you go, there's one last question I'd like to ask you, and you can choose not to answer this one. So who are you going to vote for?
I'm an Indian citizen, so I actually not going to be voting at all. No, I voted in last year's election in Delhi. I'm not going to vote here, and in some ways that's a good position for me to be in, because I feel like I can comment in a neutral and dispassionate manner. I don't support one candidate or the other. My job is as an analyst. In some ways, I think it frees you up to be a better analyst if you're not rooting for one particular side. I do think, however, there's certain obviously I agree and disagree with certain policies that both candidates in both parties advance. I've had the pleasure of working with both Republicans and Democrats, including people who have in the past and presently advised both Trump and Biden. So that helps to give a sort of familiarity with their worldviews and with their policy platforms. But it's sometimes nice to be neutral.
All right. So there's not any one candidate that's going to be either Trump or Biden and not going to be bad for India, or there are certain things that
what I've tried to point out in my writing is that let's look at both of their platforms. Let's look at what's an ideal perspective from India. Neither fits a completely ideal platform, but neither is completely disastrous either. So let's see, what are areas where cooperation is likely to increase under a Biden or a Trump administration, and what are areas where we may anticipate some difficulties. So, if Trump is reelected, I expect we will see some difficulties on the immigration front, for example, where many of his impulses on immigration will be validated by a reelection, and he will pursue them more aggressively. With the Biden administration, I think there are some concerns, particularly on the less directly his India policy, but more his China, and Pakistan policies, and what the secondary implications of that might mean for India. So, unfortunately, on the latter, we've seen some clarification from Biden in the last few weeks and his advisors, which ought to put some concerns in Delhi at least temporarily to rest. But a lot of things again will depend. Just because it will be a new presidency if he wins, a lot of things will be depend on who gets selected to key positions.
Dhruv, I was going to end this, but then there's someone asking a question about you, per se. Someone asking, what was your inspiration, Dhruva, to take up the interest into international affairs?
In some ways, I fell into it by accident. I did not study it as an undergraduate. I studied history. I think because of that, look at things from a historical point of view. I like to think it helps me to take a long-term view on issues rather than be obsessed with the day-to-day. I fell into it, I think, by accident a little bit. I was looking for something to do after college. I moved to Washington after college and interned at a place where they were interested in U.S.-India relations. And it just happened to be at a time in 2005 when the U.S.-India relationship, following the announcement of a civil nuclear agreement, there was suddenly a lot of interest in India, and there was not that many people who had interest or background in India. So I started off as an intern at a think tank. I moved back to India briefly, worked in journalism, then moved back, as a research assistant at a think tank in Delhi. And one of the things that, I grew up around the world. I grew up in India for parts of it and abroad for parts of it. And one of the things I think that came a little bit naturally to me was, having an ability to look at things from an inside and outside, and sometimes explain where you're from to people who are not familiar. So I found that these were things that I'd been doing my entire life in a way. Subsequently, I then went back to graduate school to study in some ways what I should have known from the outset. So I studied security studies, and then
you studied in Minnesota.
I did my undergraduate in Minnesota, and then my master's at Georgetown, and while working as well at a think tank. And so I basically bounced, from Brookings to a place called the German Marshall Fund, where I was for 6.5 years. Then back to Brookings. I moved back to India for 3.5 years to work at Brookings in India. and then now setting up ORF in Washington. So this is, in some ways, it's I look back, it's a bit of an accidental trajectory. It was not something, until I was 20, 21 years old, it was not something I ever intended to do. I wanted to do something completely different. But that is sort of one step led to another, and that's kind of how I fell into this.
All right, Dhruva, I'm holding you here longer, but there are so many questions coming in. Someone's asking, is there any advice from Dhruva for young Indians as to why they should take more interest in international news and affairs?
So the short answer is, I think everybody frankly should. Every citizen of India should, because today we're in a world where what happens abroad, what happens in other parts of the world, has very direct consequences for average Indians. And sometimes very mundane, seemingly boring matters of foreign policy actually affect the day-to-day lives of many people. And I'll give a few examples of that. And I think some negative examples come to mind recently. I think the coronavirus pandemic is one of them. Something that started in a market in Wuhan, China, is today, affecting almost everybody around the world, either directly or indirectly, because of the economic consequences of it. So that, I think, is a sort of negative factor. But I'll give you a couple of positive examples of that. Today, if you look at the state of public health in India, how much of it was due to international institutions such as the WHO, to bilateral agreements that made the cost of pharmaceuticals cheaper for average Indians, for license production. So these are some things that actually help, literally matters of life and death to people, whether they can get their medication or not. But it's something that has been facilitated by sometimes a very arcane and obscure set of international norms and institutions and financial arrangements and so forth. And the role of not just governments but large international foundations and such has been pivotal to that, such as the Gates Foundation. Another example is something like the metro systems that are now cropping up. Delhi is one example, but in almost every other major, Bengaluru and many other cities as well. And that was something that was facilitated by arrangements on lending from places. Japan financed the Delhi metro, but it involved cooperation from South Korea, Hong Kong, Germany, and many other countries to show that this was possible in a country where, I remember 20 years ago people saying it is not possible for India to have a world-class public rapid transit system. Today that.
Yet there's India now supplying hydrochloroquine to many countries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So every time people say that something is just not possible, and that's just one example, but there are several others that come to mind. And then another example I like to cite is the telecom revolution in India, which again we take for granted today. Everybody has a mobile handset and a connection, but the initial process of making that happen was not an accident. It required certain very specific policy changes, both domestic and foreign, to basically incentivize the building of that infrastructure in India. So again, these are just some examples of how foreign affairs affects the day-to-day life. It affects where you go, where you can study, your educational opportunities, it affects your employment opportunities, it affects how costly your dal or your oil is, your petrol is. So I think for all of these reasons, average Indians should care about what happens. Sometimes not about the salacious stuff. I don't think it matters as much that Kamala Harris is of Indian origin. It's obviously significant, but sometimes a very obscure agreement on infrastructure financing from Canada will have outsized implications for a country like India.
All right. On that note, Dhruva, I kept you here very long, but there were so many questions coming in. Thank you so much for talking about it, Voice, and thank you so much for taking our time. Sorry for the initial fumble. Sometimes you make mistakes. It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for answering all the pertinent questions that we had for you. Thank you.
Sure. Bye.